From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm happy to see so many lovers of science here, bright and early, right at 10 o'clock. We no longer have the green grass of the National Mall under our feet, but we do have air conditioning, which may help you last a bit longer as you walk the halls and meet all the marvelous writers today. I'm Bonnie Benwick, Deputy Editor and Recipe Editor of the Washington Post Food Section. This is the 15th year that the Library of Congress has hosted the National Book Festival here in Washington, and I'm proud to say the Post has been a sponsor since the event began. 2 years ago, I was honored with an invitation to speak about the Washington Post cookbook, Readers' Favorite Recipes. And I have a confession to make right off the bat. Like our author today, I love to cook what's fresh from the garden, but I don't have much luck growing it. Not a gardener. Nonetheless, I can still appreciate the growing enterprise of her to kick off the Science Pavilion series, Andrea Wulf. When she visited Washington in 2011, the Post gardening columnist Adrienne Higgins described the genius of her bestseller, Founding Gardeners, the revolutionary generation, nature, and the shaping of the American nation, as wrapping a quartet of iconic American figures in the zeitgeist of the postmodern victory garden. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison were all dirt under the fingernails gardeners whose love of the soil shaped the way they forged a nascent country. Wulf says their passion for planting and gardening and agriculture is deeply woven into the fabric of America and totally aligned with their political thought. It makes me think that the moderators of our next presidential debates should ask the men and women at the podiums to dish the dirt, literally, and describe their own horticultural relationships. I would rather hear about that. I'm guessing it would increase the viewership. Her 2009 book, The Brother Gardeners, earned an American Horticultural Society Award for its vivid and lively tales of 18th century botanist adventurers who helped turn England into a nation of gardeners by sending home the issue of the colony's evergreens and describing the flowers of far-off Tahiti. Wulf's own roots are multicultural. She was born in India and moved to Germany as a child. She lives in north of London today, having moved there in the mid-1990s. After she moved, originally, she studied design history at the Royal College of Art. She has written or co-written 5 books, including Chasing Venus in 2012, in which she set her sights on the heavens of the 1760s instead of the earth. And she's a 3-time fellow of the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. In 2013, she was the British Library's Eccles Writers in Residence. The book you've come to hear her talk about today may introduce you to an 18th century German explorer who was born the same year as Napoleon Bonaparte, and, as Wulf makes the case, is responsible for our understanding of much of the natural world. And thanks to her, I learned that Nevada was almost called Humboldt in his honor. She followed some of the explorer's footsteps in researching the invention of nature, and I bet I'm not the only one here who can't wait to hear her tell us all about it. Join me in welcoming writer Andrea Wulf.
You stole my Nevada joke. I'm so honored to be here. This is the very first time I'm publicly speaking about this book, so forgive me if I'm not 100% fluid with it yet. But let me start with a quote about Alexander von Humboldt. This is what Ralph Waldo Emerson said about him in 1869. Humboldt was one of those wonders of the world, like Aristotle, like Julius Caesar, who appear from time to time as if to show us the possibilities of the human mind. Yet, over the past few years, whenever I told someone that I'm writing a book about Humboldt, the most common reaction I got was a blank face, because very few people have heard of him in the English-speaking world. It probably doesn't help that I say Humboldt instead of Humboldt, which is the American way to pronounce it. But I'm German, he was German, and since he's not that well known here, I think we might as well learn to pronounce his name properly, Humboldt. However, if I say Humboldt, I have a little bit of a chance that some people might recognize his name, because his name lingers everywhere. In fact, there are more places, plants, and animals named after Humboldt than anyone else. There is, for example, the Humboldt Current, which is the ocean current that hugs the west coast of South America. There's the Humboldt penguin, the Californian Humboldt lily, and there's a fierce giant squid called the Humboldt squid. In Latin America alone, there are mountain ranges in parks. There are mountain ranges in China, in New Zealand, in South America. In North America, there are 4 counties, 13 towns named after him. There's a mountain, a lake, a river. And the state of Nevada was almost called Humboldt. So, which I would have loved that, obviously. Imagine saying Las Vegas, Humboldt. But let's have, so there's this man who's, his name is everywhere, but who is this man? Because no one really knows about him. So Alexander von Humboldt was born in 1769, same year as Napoleon, and he was the second son of very wealthy Prussian aristocratic family in Berlin. And when his parents died, they left him a fortune, and he was a very rich man. He was so rich that he bragged, "I have so much money that I can get my nose, mouth, and ears gilded." So he was also a bit of a show-off, clearly. But he left his life of privilege and went on a dangerous 5-year exploration of Latin America. It was a voyage that shaped his life and his thinking, and that made him legendary across the world. And there's a lovely anecdote when Frederick the Great, the Prussian king, asked the young Alexander von Humboldt if he intended to conquer the world like his namesake, Alexander the Great, to which Humboldt answered, "Yes, sir, but with my head." And that's exactly what he did. So he was a visionary thinker and scientist. His contemporaries described him as the most famous man after Napoleon. They called him the Shakespeare of the sciences. His books were huge bestsellers. In fact, he wrote so many that he himself lost track how many he had written and when they were published. Knowledge, he believed, had to be exchanged, shared, and made available for everybody. So he wrote dozens of books, and he also wrote about 50,000 letters and received about double that number. He was, as one contemporary said, the greatest man since the deluge. He influenced scientists, artists, poets, thinkers. Walt Whitman, for example, the German poet Goethe, William Wordsworth, just to name a few. Thomas Jefferson called him one of the greatest ornaments of the age. Napoleon was jealous of Humboldt. Charles Darwin said he would have never boarded the Beagle without him, and therefore not conceived the origin of species. Henry David Thoreau's Walden would have been a very different book without Humboldt. And John Muir's ideas on forest preservation were heavily influenced by Humboldt's ideas. Simon Bolivar called Humboldt the discoverer of the New World, and even Captain Nemo in Jules Verne's famous 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea owned all of Humboldt's books. He died in 1869, a few months before his 90th birthday and a few months before The Origin of Species was published. And 10 years later, did I just say he died in 1869? He died in 1859. And 10 years later, in 1869, the centennial of his birth was celebrated across the world. There were parties in Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Melbourne, Berlin, like everywhere across the world, they had parties. And some of the greatest celebrations were in the United States. In New York, for example, 25,000 people marched through Manhattan in his honor. There were parties in Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, and San Francisco. America was utterly in love with Humboldt. Yet today, he's almost forgotten here. So the question is, why should we care about a man who's forgotten? I think there are lots of reasons. One is that Humboldt came up with a concept of nature that still shapes our thinking today. He came up with this idea that nature is a web of life. He described Earth as a great living organism where everything is connected, from the tiniest insect to the tallest tree. He brought together art and science when he said that we needed to use our imagination to understand nature. He's also the forgotten father of environmentalism because he warned of the devastating environmental effects of monoculture, irrigation, and deforestation. Amazingly, in 1800, he predicted harmful human-induced climate change. So he was a genius polymath who roamed across the disciplines. He discovered the magnetic equator, for example. He invented isotherms, the wavy lines you still see on weather maps today. More than a century before scientists talked about the shifting tectonic plates, he talked about an ancient connection between Africa and South America. He understood the idea of a keystone species 200 years before the concept was named. And he defined global climate and vegetation zones at a time when other scientists were looking through the narrow lens of classification. All this is incredibly important, but what I think was much more important than in his individual discoveries is that he came up with a worldview, a holistic worldview that still shapes our thinking today. So my book, The Invention of Nature, is my attempt to find Humboldt and to place him or restore him to his rightful place in the pantheon of nature and science. And the great thing about doing a book about an explorer is that you get to go to pretty amazing places yourself, all in the name of research, of course. So for me, this has been an incredible journey through landscapes and letters, from California to Cambridge, from Venezuela to Ecuador, from Germany to Italy and to the United States. In Berlin, I read Humboldt's manuscripts in the archives there. I found his Spanish passport in an archive in Quito in Ecuador. On the Antisana, which is a volcano in the Andes, I climbed up and I found at 13,000 feet this hut. It's a hut in which Humboldt had spent a night in 1802. And while I was standing there, there were 4 condors circling above me, and a herd of wild horses suddenly appeared. So that was a pretty spectacular moment. I paddled along the Orinoco and listened to the strange bellowing cries of the howler monkey in the Venezuelan rainforest. I walked around Walden Pond in freshly fallen snow, and I went to the Yosemite, where John Muir had implemented Humboldt's ideas of forest preservation. Appropriately, when researching an explorer, I also experienced a hurricane, admittedly not in Latin America, but in New York, when I got stuck there while I was doing research in Hurricane Sandy for 5 days without electricity. I didn't do a lot of research that time. But the most exciting moment for me was climbing Chimborazo, the volcano in the Andes in Ecuador, which had been so elemental to Humboldt's vision of nature. And as I walked up the barren mountain slope, my admiration for Humboldt grew with every single step. I stopped at 16,400 feet, but he went further. So let me take you up Chimborazo, 100 miles south of Quito in Ecuador. This is a drawing in one of Humboldt's books. So it's the 23rd of June, 1802. Humboldt and his 3 companions are crawling on hands and feet along a high, narrow ridge. At 21,000 feet, Chimborazo is believed to be the highest mountain in the world. To their left is a steep, ice-encrusted cliff. To the right, it doesn't look much better. There's a 1,000-foot drop. Their hands and feet are numb from the icy wind. Their gums are bleeding. Their eyes are bloodshot. Chimborazo's peak is hidden in thick fog, and they can't really see anything. They're at 17,000 feet, and they're struggling to breathe the thin air. Every few hundred yards, Humboldt stops and takes out his scientific instruments to measure humidity, gravity, altitude, and the blueness of the sky. and then he records everything meticulously. Suddenly, the fog lifts, and they can see the snow-capped peak of Chimborazo against the blue sky. But they also see there's a huge crevasse in front of them. They are at 19,413 feet, about 1,000 feet below the peak. But they know they cannot get across this crevasse, so they have to stop here. And although they have to stop here, Humboldt has received something absolutely remarkable here, because no one anywhere in the world had ever been so high. For 30 years, he held the world record in climbing. But as he stood at the top of the world, looking down at the mountains below him, his vision of nature clarified, and everything fell into place. For Humboldt, the days they had spent traveling from Quito up the Chimborazo had been like a botanical journey from the equator to the poles, from the tropical species they had seen in the valley to the lichen they had seen close to the snow line. What Humboldt realized here was that many of the plants he was seeing were similar to the ones he had seen elsewhere, in the Alps in Switzerland, in the Pyrenees in Spain, and in Tenerife. He was struck, he said, by this resemblance which we trace in climates most distant from each other. No one had ever looked at plants like this before. Where other scientists were looking through the categories of classification, Humboldt viewed nature as a global force with corresponding vegetation and climate zones across continents. But let me tell you a little bit about his exploration. So he and his travel companion, the French botanist Aimé Bonpland, left in June 1799, and they spent, which is just before his 30th birthday, and they spent 5 years in Latin America. And I'm going to have to skip over some really exciting bits because we only have 30 minutes, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor what kind of man Humboldt was. So, well, for one thing, he had a very restless mind. He admitted himself that he was impelled by a perpetual drive, as if chased by 10,000 pigs. He also said, "There's a drive in me that often makes me feel as if I'm losing my mind." He was obsessed with measurements. He schlepped 42 instruments across Latin America, all individually packed in velvet-lined boxes, from microscopes, a huge pendulum clock, and then I'll just show you a few here, telescope, a travel barometer, which was incredibly important for him, and a hygrometer, which he used to measure the humidity with. But he was more than just interested in empirical data. He said that we had to feel nature in order to understand nature. So he said, where other scientists were looking for universal laws, he said that nature must be experienced through feelings and imagination. So he was really driven by this sense of wonder. And of course, he was brazenly adventurous. Take, for example, his journey along the Orinoco and the surrounding river network. Humboldt and Bonpland paddled for 1,400 miles along the rivers, 75 grueling days through the deepest rainforest where very few white men had ever gone. And it made, of course, for very dangerous traveling. Their boat capsized, for example. They encountered crocodiles, jaguars, snakes, and mosquitoes. They almost starved to death. But the rainforest was also the most magnificent ecosystem, the most magnificent web of life on Earth. And Humboldt was interested in everything. He tasted, for example, the water of the different rivers like a wine connoisseur and kind of like noted it all down. He was fascinated by plants and animals, such as the howler monkeys, for example, with their bellowing cries that travel for several miles through the jungle. He discovered the Brazil nut and subsequently introduced it to Europe. But he was not only interested in nature, he was also fascinated by the indigenous people. Unlike other Europeans, he did not regard them as savages. He always questioned the local people because he wanted to learn from them, and he very often included them in his landscape paintings. There it is. So you can see, so this is him and Bonpland and a native person. And then I'll show you a detail, which is, I think, my favorite. Don't you love that? Humboldt is, of course, the one with the top hat and the very muscular legs and bottom. It's tiny on the picture. You have to really look very closely. He also brought home sketches of Inca monuments and Aztec manuscripts, and showed the Europeans that these ancient civilizations were sophisticated cultures with very rich languages and architecture. He also saw how humankind destroyed nature, and it became very clear to him when he went to a region in northern Venezuela around Lake Valencia, which was a very thriving agricultural region at that time. But what he saw here was that as trees had been felled to make way for cash crops, the rains had washed off the good topsoil, and also the water levels of the lake were falling because farmers had diverted the water to irrigate their fields. Seeing the destruction of the forest here, he was the first to explain the fundamental functions of the forest for the ecosystem and the climate. He talked about the trees' ability to store water, their ability to enrich the atmosphere with moisture, their protection against soil erosion, and their cooling effect. It was here at Lake Valencia that he first predicted harmful human-induced climate change. He wrote that it was mankind's mischief which disturbs nature's order. And a little later, he listed the 3 ways in which humankind is affecting the climate. This is what he wrote: through the destruction of forests, through the distribution of water, i.e. irrigation, and through the production of great masses of steam and gas at the industrial centers. He wrote this in 1832. Pretty amazing, isn't it? We're still not listening to him. Humboldt and Bonpland explored Venezuela and the Orinoco. Then they went to Cuba, and then they went back to South America, and they traveled 2,500 miles through the Andes from the northern coast of what's Colombia today all the way down to Lima. As they crossed the Andes, they climbed every reachable volcano, and by the time they climbed Chimborazo in June 1802, they were the most experienced mountain climbers in the world. The more difficult it was, the more Humboldt seemed to have enjoyed himself. And he was also a bit of a show-off, as I said earlier. So this is what he wrote to a friend in Germany from Latin America after he'd written in great detail about the dangers he had encountered with jaguars and snakes and crocodiles. He wrote to his friend, "And you, dearest, how is your monotonous life?" In April 1804, they, also having spent a year in Mexico, they left Latin America and wanted to return to Europe, but Humboldt added a detour to the United States because he wanted to meet the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, whom he greatly admired. After almost drowning in a hurricane on their way, they finally arrived in Philadelphia at the end of May 1804, and then went down to Washington, the new capital of the young nation, and this is from 1801, so this is very similar to the Washington that Humboldt would have seen. In DC, Humboldt was passed from one person to the next. Everybody was very excited to meet the heroic explorers. Dolly Madison said that all the ladies say they're in love with him. Well, he was quite handsome, I think. James Madison hosted a party for him, and Thomas Jefferson hosted a dinner at the White House for him. He also went to Mount Vernon. Of course, Washington was not alive anymore then. So this was the social side of his visit, but there was also a political side. And the timing of Humboldt's visit could have not been more perfect, because Jefferson had just acquired in the previous year the Louisiana Territory. And he bombarded Humboldt with questions about their new neighbor, Mexico. And Humboldt very happily unpacked his notebooks and his maps to brief the President of the United States. One of the most pressing questions for Jefferson was the disputed border between Mexico and the United States. The United States claimed that it was the Rio Grande, which today forms the western border of Texas, and the Spanish claimed it was the Sabine River, which is part of the eastern border of Texas. And up there you can see it's the Humboldt River. It was not named then Humboldt. So the ownership of a huge region was at stake, and Jefferson wanted to know everything, and Humboldt delivered plentiful, including 18 tightly written pages summarizing information about agriculture, commerce, and mining. And this document is still at the Library of Congress today. This was exactly the kind of intelligence that Jefferson needed, and unsurprisingly, he called Humboldt one of the great worthies of the world. Humboldt returned to Europe in August 1804, and he settled in Paris, because no other city at that time was so deeply steeped in science, in the sciences. And soon Humboldt established himself as the center of scientific inquiry. He was so famous that if visitors arrived to Paris and wanted to see him, they didn't need his address. They could just tell the cab driver, "Chez Monsieur de Humboldt," and they would be taken there. So during the day, he was a busy man with his scientific work, but during the evening, he literally dashed from one salon to another, 5 or 6 every evening. He gave a half-an-hour performance, basically. He talked incredibly fast, and he never stayed for very long. And there are hundreds of descriptions of his contemporaries of that time about him. One, for example, described him as an overcharged instrument which never stops playing. Another said he was like a comet that swished through the room. He also had the reputation of having a little bit of a malicious tongue. There were people who refused to leave a party before Humboldt had departed because they were worried that they would be the object of his snide comments. He could only sustain this rather frantic work pace by sleeping very little and by drinking lots of coffee, which he called concentrated sunshine. He was, as a friend said, drunken with his love for the sciences. But the exploration and then the publications ate up his entire fortune. And in 1827, aged 57, and after more than 20 years in Paris, he decided to leave Paris and to move back to Berlin, a city he absolutely hated. And one of the reasons was that the Prussian king had paid Humboldt for more than 2 decades an annual stipend, and the king was now requesting his presence in Berlin. So having absolutely, completely run out of money, Humboldt really didn't have a chance or a choice, so he moved back to Berlin. He also went, age 60, in 1829, on another exploration, this time through Russia, 10,000 miles, in 6 months, and he did that to collect the data he needed to complete his global investigation of nature. He returned to Berlin, fizzing with so many ideas that a friend said that he was steaming like a pot of boiling water. He was finally ready to write the book that would make him really, really famous everywhere, and that was Cosmos. It took him more than 10 years just to publish the first volume, and the last volume was published just after his death. It was translated into a dozen languages, and in Cosmos, Humboldt took his readers on an incredible journey from Earth to outer space, from volcanoes to the tiniest fleck of moss, from poetry and landscape painting to botany. It was unlike any other book ever published, where other scientists were crawling at that time into their narrowing disciplines, scientific disciplines. Humboldt did exactly the opposite. Humboldt wrote a book that connected everything. It was a portrait of nature pulsating with life, and it was a declaration of love. It was also the book that made Humboldt famous across the world and in the United States. Walt Whitman composed his celebrated poetry collection, Leaves on Grass, with a copy of Cosmos on his desk. Edgar Allan Poe admired it, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Thoreau, and John Muir. My book, The Invention of Nature, is as much about Humboldt himself as about the people he influenced, because I think that is the extraordinary thing about him. 8 of them get their own chapters in the book, and I'm just going to run quickly through them so you can see who they are. So there's the German poet Goethe, Thomas Jefferson, Simón Bolívar, the man who liberated the Spanish colonies in South America, Charles Darwin, Henry David Thoreau, the German scientist Ernst Haeckel, who combined art and science in his work and who coined the word ecology, John Muir, and then George Perkins Marsh, who wrote a book in 1864 called Man and Nature. It was an incredibly important environmental book. But we don't have time to talk about these, so I'm quickly going to tell you a little bit about Humboldt's influence on Muir, the man who we call today the father of the national parks. Muir grew up reading Humboldt's books and said as a young man how intensely I desired to be a Humboldt. He owned many of Humboldt's books and he heavily annotated them. And amazingly, these books still exist in an archive in California. So when you read them, it's like reading a dialogue that Muir has with Humboldt. And they make for remarkable reading because Humboldt was instrumental in Muir's ecological thinking and his ideas of forest preservation. He also devised his own extensive indexes in his book. So this is a copy of Humboldt's book, Views of Nature, and this is Muir's index at the end of the book. It's an index where he highlights, for example, passages about the role of the forest for the ecosystem, but also about the destructive force of agriculture and deforestation, which he then all applied in his fight for the Yosemite. Muir was also inspired by Humboldt's vision of nature as an interconnected whole, as a big web of life. So Muir's famous sentence, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe, really owes a great deal to Humboldt. Like Humboldt, Muir was driven by a sense of wonder, and it kind of launched him into a deeply sensual relationship with nature, and it's a relationship that seems to jump from every page. And I'm going to read you a quote from this letter, which is almost a love letter to the sequoia. So this is what Muir wrote: "I'm in the woods, 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 and there in me, the king tree and me have sworn eternal love, and I wish I was so drunk and sequoiacal that I could preach the green-brown woods to all the juiceless world." So it's this idea of that you use your emotions, your feeling, and your imagination to understand nature. And one of my favorite stories about Muir is when he went with Charles Sargent, who was then the director of the Arnold Arboretum, to climb a mountain. And Muir is so excited seeing this kind of beautiful scenery. He's jumping up and down. And Sargent stood, as Muir said, cool as a rock. And when Muir said, "Why?" Sargent replied, "I don't wear my heart upon my sleeve." This is Muir's reply. "Who cares where you wear your little heart, man? There you stand in the face of all heaven come down to earth, like a critic of the universe, as if to say, 'Come, nature, bring on best what you have. I am from Boston.'" But let me end with one final look at Humboldt. Is he coming up? Well, there he is. He's still very handsome when he's old, isn't he? So I wanted to just explain very, very briefly why I think he is so important today still, and we should kind of, remember him. One reason is that his story really explains why we understand nature the way we understand it. Environmentalists, ecologists, nature writers are all still firmly rooted in Humboldt's ideas, although many have never heard of him, but he still is their founding father. And one of Humboldt's, I believe, greatest achievements is to make knowledge accessible and popular, which, look at this book festival, it's free, everybody can come. So that's very much a kind of Humboldtian idea. His beliefs in the free exchange of information, in uniting scientists, in fostering communication across disciplines remains an important pillar of science today. Today we tend to draw a sharp line between the arts and the sciences, between the objective and the subjective, and Humboldt's insight that we can only understand nature by using our feelings and imagination, I think, is still very relevant today. And maybe most importantly, at a time when scientists today are trying to understand and predict the global consequences of climate change, Humboldt's interdisciplinary methods and his idea, his concept of nature as one of global patterns is more relevant than ever before. His insights that social, economic, and political issues are closely related to environmental problems are still very important today. More than 150 years ago, Humboldt already warned that the restless activity of large communities of man gradually despoil the face of the earth. To me, it feels like we've come full circle, and maybe it's time for us in the environmental movement to reclaim Humboldt as our hero. The German poet Goethe compared Humboldt to a fountain with many spouts from which streams flow refreshingly and infinitely. That fountain, I believe, has never run dry. Thank you. Thank you. I am very happy to take questions, if you have any. Yes?
Yes, you know, I love all those incredible drawings, sketches, and did he do those on the spot, right there in the jungle?
So his landscape drawings in his publications are absolutely beautiful. They are actually not drawn by him. So what he did is he did lots of sketches while they were out there, and we have them. And then he gave them to artists in Paris and in Italy, explained everything. I mean, he's a micromanager, explained everything, how they should do it, and then published them. That's one of the reasons why he was completely broke after a while, because his publications were so sumptuous, and it was so expensive to pay all these engravers and artists and map makers.
Did he bring back the samples to show them? I mean, they're just so detailed, I can't imagine.
Yes, so he did lots. He has them there, and we still have them. They're all his diaries from that time, and they're full of sketches. I mean, they came back, they had problems going through customs when they're coming out of the United States to going to Europe. So Madison actually wrote him a passport, and on there it says that he brought back 40 trunks filled with notes and collections. He brought back, Humboldt boasted because he is a show-off, he brought back more to Europe than anyone else before.
What about the actual samples of the plant? Did he bring those in?
Oh, yeah. They pressed plants and brought them. I mean, of course, a lot of them were lost because, the humidity in the rainforest and stuff like that. But they brought back a lot of plants, and a lot of them are still in Berlin in the botanical garden there, in the herbarium. Yes?
Yes, thank you so much for doing so much in his honor. I'd like to argue a bit that maybe Humboldt's name is not quite as well known as a Darwin, but his concepts are internalized in writing all the way up through E.O. Wilson. So I think that in looking at his long-term effect, as you were arguing, the real issue is with the overburdened world of population and how a world deals with 7 billion people versus the ideals that he would espouse.
Well, so you're saying basically two things, aren't you? That he is, I would also argue that his ideas have become we take them so for granted that they've almost disappeared. Of course, he was not dealing with overpopulation at that time. So that is, although he has these incredibly long lists, wherever he goes also to archives. He has these incredibly long lists about how many people are living where, and he's very interested in population actually in terms of how that could create problems. So, one of the things he criticizes a lot in South America is obviously colonialism and slavery. He was, a lifelong abolitionist. So he's looking at, there's so many percentage of slaves, of indigenous people, of white people, and so he's interested in that, but he's obviously not dealing with overpopulation at that time.
Who or what inspired him? I mean, Charles Darwin had a famous grandfather, but where did he just decide to take off and go and do all this? I mean, did he have...
Well, I think there are several. So he claims that it was a visit to the botanical garden in Berlin. So he saw these kind of like exotic plants and wanted to see them in their in their real landscapes. He's also someone, if you look at his childhood, he had a very emotionally repressed mother. He as a child, didn't very much like books, so he escaped from the schoolroom basically into the surrounding forest of the estate where they lived. So he always thought that nature is very soothing, he said. I would also argue that, he is the most curious man I've ever come across, but he's also vain, and he wanted to be famous. He wanted to leave a mark in this world. So I think it's a kind of combination of things, but he had a very thorough Enlightenment education. He comes from a very wealthy aristocratic family, so he might have not had a famous grandfather like Darwin, but he was surrounded by Enlightenment thinkers.
Thank you.
I'm one of those lucky few who got to hear you last night and this morning, so special treat. I was wondering if you could comment about the sort of unusual relationship or not relationship of course, Humboldt University in Berlin was named after Wilhelm, as I understand it, but then after World War II, under communism, there was an attempt to sort of make it Alexander and Wilhelm. If you could comment about that, and today, does Humboldt University try to associate more with Alexander? Does it do a good job? Any insights?
As far as I know, the university was always called after the two brothers, although Wilhelm, his brother, he has an older brother who's 2 years older, is the one who founds the university. I'm not 100% sure if there's a clash between those two, who is more celebrated. I think it really depends, quite frankly, which discipline you are coming from. So, for example, my very, very first essay at university was on Wilhelm Humboldt's linguistics theories, because I was studying linguistics and philosophy. So I had never heard of Alexander, only of Wilhelm. And then I think if you are more interested in botany or geology, you hear more about Alexander. So whoever there is trying to, from where you come, they're trying to push their brother a little bit more, I suppose. I think we have one more question, time for one more question. I can't see anyone. Okay.
Hi, thanks very much. So you said he died 10 years before On the Origin of Species. Did he develop any early ideas around evolution, or did he have a concept?
Because I got the dates, they're slightly wrong. He dies a few months before The Origin of Species, and he dies in May 1859, and The Origin of Species is published in November 1869. He is called, yes, to answer your question, yes, he is in fact called by several contemporaries, or a little later, a pre-Darwinian Darwinist. So he talks about changing species. He talks about that nature, because he understands nature as a living organism. He sees it as something that's in flux, and that for me is the extraordinary thing. So I have a whole chapter about Darwin in this. So Darwin, like Muir, reads Humboldt's books, and he takes Humboldt's books on the Beagle. They are next. He has a very limited space on the shelf, and he takes the 7 volumes of Humboldt's personal narrative, and these books are still there, the books he took on the Beagle. So, and you read in there, and Humboldt writes a lot about the battle between animals, the kind of struggle of survival. He doesn't call it struggle of survival, and Muir and Darwin underlines all of that. So, yes. Absolutely. If Humboldt had read The Origin of Species, he would have absolutely agreed with it. I think is that it? Okay. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.